Shabbat Shalom, great men of Yahweh. We're going to be picking up this evening in the 15th book of Yisrayl, chapter 15. This sermon was given May 25th, 2015, and the title of this sermon is "The Catholic Church Will Go No Further in Its Deception. It's Being Made Manifest by Yahweh's Last Day's Work." And this was the sermon given Feast of Pentecost 2015. And if you'll turn over here, if you have your books or if you have your notebooks and you write down, we're starting off here on page 164. And we're going to start, the pastor starts off in verse 1. Shalom, everyone. Aw, man, this is beautiful, isn't it? Wow. Joyful cheering and praise to Yahweh. They're all yours, Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. You may be seated. You may be seated. May Yahweh bless each and every one of you. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. And you see that when Pastor comes out on the Sabbath or the feast, you know, he's actually lifting us up to Father Yahweh. He says here, they're all yours, Yahweh. You know, so like the first righteous priest Abel presented an offering of people, you know, of people who had converted to Yahweh's laws and were practicing Yahweh's laws. Pastor's doing the same thing in these last days in lifting us up to Father Yahweh as being acceptable sacrifices. And we're going to start off here in verse 5, skipping down a little bit past the technical difficulties there, but Pastor said, I've got to show you this, and it's an article, it's entitled, Pope's Pronouncement Making Trouble for GOP Catholics. And, of course, this was, you know, a year and a half ago, so the political structure was a little different than what we see lining up right now. It's talking about the politicians here. Catholic Republicans are developing a pope problem. Earlier this month, Francis recognized Palestinian statehood. And this summer, he's going to issue an encyclical condemning environmental degradation. And in September, just as the GOP primary race heats up, Francis will travel to Washington to address Congress on climate change, which of course we've seen all that take place, and a lot more is taking place, you know, even just the last 2 weeks here, where you see this this push for this the finishing of the Oslo Accords, and with the finishing with the two-state solution, you know, where there's a separate Palestine and Israel that will be recognized by the world, you know, and it first here started here with the Pope pushing this. Okay, because the Vatican's the first one, they recognized Palestinian statehood, and then a short time after that, the United Nations recognized Palestinian statehood. And then we see now where the president and his cabinet, they're trying to push forward, you know, this final agreement, the final status agreement that was never fulfilled by getting this two-state solution pushed through. In verse 6, Pastor says, but key Republican primary constituencies, hawks, climate change skeptics, and religious conservatives, including some Catholics, are wary of the Pope's progressivism. This could turn into a big-time problems for the Pope, Pastor says, but the Vatican will fight back. As I said yesterday, they want to resurrect the Roman Empire, where they can use force instead of trying to persuade by their propaganda and lies. Lies, yes, they don't mind lying at all. They lie all the time. So we see the Catholic Church wants to resurrect this Roman Empire where they can use their force, their military might, instead of trying to persuade by their propaganda and lies. And I don't know if you remember, but when the Pope did come and visit in September of 2015, when he came and he visited Congress, you know, it was just like a couple days later, you know, that the head of the GOP, John Boehner, he actually resigned. You know, he resigned his post of being Speaker of the House and actually turned it over to now they have Paul Ryan as the Speaker of the House. But you could just see how, like Pastor said many years ago, you know, they take out those that don't agree with their plans. They take them out. And whether it's by what they tell them, you know, you need to get out, or whether they actually take them out, like, you know, we see a lot of times in different areas of the world, where people suddenly die and have these, accidents, these really strange accidents. They take out those that don't agree with the plans of the Catholic Church, and they push in leaders that are going to support these things. And the funny thing is they're all Catholics, but I guess maybe, some of them aren't fulfilling their obligations in a speedy enough manner, so they kind of push out one Catholic and push in another Catholic. And we see right now where we're about to see something that's never been seen before if it takes place, or that hasn't been seen in a long, long time. We're about to see all three branches of the government, actually ruled by this one party, that doesn't really have, if you've seen any of the news, doesn't have problems doing things that would seem untraditional or against people's views or values. And we might actually start seeing what Pastor's been saying for many years. We'll start seeing these laws come into place that people wouldn't even imagine could be in place. Like that you have to go worship, God on a specific day. That you have to eat certain foods. That you have to take certain things in order to be, an upstanding citizen, and anyone who doesn't would be considered as a outcast or a heretic. So it'll be very, very interesting time we're living in here. It's going to be a nice, interesting couple of weeks here to see what takes place if they get to where they're trying to go. But just remember that all these things, don't get too caught up in politics or governmental organization, in the sense that we know all of these things are ruled by the leader of the kings of the earth. It's by this Vatican system, from the 7 hills of Rome, that these orders go out, and either people will follow and do as they're instructed, or they'll be removed and someone else will be put into office that's going to follow their instructions. So this wouldn't be the first time we see someone claiming to do certain things, and then as soon as they get into office, they totally backtrack and turn around and go the other way. Because I imagine it's pretty fearful. I remember years ago they showed a Dateline interview here in the sanctuary, and it was Carl Bernstein. I think he had written a book about Pope John Paul II, and in some of his interviews he had done and things that he had witnessed, he talked to the extreme power and the might of this man, this leader of the Vatican. He said that world leaders, when they stood before the Pope, their knees would actually be shaken. They'd be trembling in fear. And what's considered to just be a religion and their leader, these kings of the earth, actually, when they came before this man, they were actually very scared, because they realized the power of this system, this Vatican system. And they even said that, he doesn't command a single foot soldier, but yet he's the most powerful man in all the world. And Carl Bernstein showed about how Pope John Paul II was actually one who brought down the Berlin Wall. He brought down the Berlin Wall and the separation, that great divide, that what was considered to be the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. It was actually Pope John Paul II that actually initiated that taking place. It wasn't, the Soviet Union or the United States that took it. It was actually the Vatican that did this. And we just saw this here in recent history with Pope Francis actually reinstating relations between Cuba and America, which hadn't been, they hadn't been communicating or trading for, many, many decades now, and then all of a sudden the Pope, he makes some trips and he talks to some people and pulls some strings, and bam, 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 and it all changes, and then now you can get Cuban cigars at your local Walmart, or I don't know where they sell them at, but we don't partake of those things. But people, things they didn't think would take place are actually taking place, and it's all driven by this Vatican system. And remember what Pastor said: they write the words and the letters, and the Pope, he's just the mouthpiece. He's the horn. He's the one that goes and delivers the messages. And he's been getting quite around. Old Pope Francis, he's been getting quite around. And if you notice in the news, he's making stops in different nations very frequently. If we continue on here in verse 12 on page 165, starting off in Jeremiah 23 verse 1, it says, "Woe to the pastors." And if you remember now, these were the pastors who were leading Yahweh's sheep at that time. And we see in many scriptures their leadership included the celebration of Christmas, Halloween, and Easter, and the goddess, the Queen of Heaven, in Daniel 11:31. If you remember that scripture, it shows that the great army would stand on his part, and they would install the Lord of the heavenly habitation in the place of Yahweh. And that's exactly what they did. And now they've moved it to Babylon and Rome because Yahweh said, "You'll not be speaking my name anymore," and he took it totally out of their mouths as the prophet prophesied that he would. Okay, so we see here, remember, as Pastor said, the temple, had been taken over by force by these violent men, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Herodians, and they installed the Lord of the heavenly habitation in the place of Yahweh. Hence why, remember, King Solomon didn't build the temple. He built the house of Yahweh. He built Yahweh a house, and these ruthless leaders actually took it over, changed the name of it, and Yahweh said they would not be speaking in his name anymore. He took it out of their mouths. Remember what the scripture says, that if you reject Yahweh, Yahweh will also reject you. Remember with King Saul, for example, King Saul, when he rejected the instructions that he was given from the one Yahweh had sent to give him the instructions, who was the prophet Samuel at that time, because he rejected Yahweh, Samuel told him, Yahweh will also reject you from being king. And he lost that rulership there. But Yahweh's shown that if you don't keep his laws, then you cut off from him. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. Yahweh's hand's not shortened that it can't save, nor his ears heavy that it cannot hear. But our own sins, our own iniquities cut us off from him. That's why it's so key important, men, and diligently striving to overcome sin and carnality. And getting these things out of our mind and dwelling upon Yahweh's laws and using Yahweh's laws as a day-to-day guide to get us through, troubling situations, problems that may arise or difficult things, and sometimes you got to really be mindful to use all that we're receiving here from Yahweh's house in order to practice Yahweh's laws, because if you're not using the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program in your day-to-day life to guide you, then you're not using Yahweh's laws in your day-to-day life. Because remember what Pastor said, the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program is the statutes and the judgments that govern Yahweh's laws. And that's where we actually are able to so allow our light to shine forth, as the scripture says. We're actually able to represent Yahweh's character through practicing the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. Because it really eliminates a lot of problems. In the front of every book, that simple teaching that Pastor received from his father, 2 wrongs don't make a right, retaliation is never the answer. There's never a time to do something that's wrong. It doesn't matter what he said, she said, they did, this occurred, 2 wrongs don't make a right. So if someone does wrong, you have to be the humble and the righteous one, the strong person, a man of Yahweh, to actually stand up for what's right and actually do what's right, even in difficult situations. And it takes that setting our mind in advance and the reading and studying and meditating of Yahweh's laws. When the scripture says, read, study, and meditate, sometimes people will think that maybe that's like just, looking at the book and just like memorizing the words or having it as a saying, but it's constantly putting these things in our minds, so that when we face a situation that we feel maybe we can't think clearly, we're actually able to bring these teachings to the forefront of our minds before we make bad choices. It's very important that we be very mindful in our day-to-day situations, our day-to-day actions, that we be very mindful of the choices we make, because the choices we make determine our future, and either we're going to start making right choices according to the teachings that Yahweh's brought us, we're actually going to build our future, or we're going to continue, or we're going to backslide, fall back into what Yahweh brought us out of, fall back into this worldly system of making wrong choices, and we're going to shorten our future to being very, very short. In verse 13 here on page 165, Pastor says, now what I want you to rehearse here, just a moment, in verse 3, he says, but I will gather the remnant. Now I brought out a lot of information on the remnant. We are the remnant. We are it. It's for the last days. This is Jeremiah 23 verse 3. He says, but I will gather. I, Yahweh, will gather the remnant of my flock out of all countries where I have driven them. Now, he's not talking about you directly, but indirectly he was talking about you being the substance of this great gathering. It's a great gathering that is going to take place. And we are this remnant that Yahweh is gathering together, bringing out of this evil, beastly system, the worst mankind has ever reached. We're at the peak of sin, the worst mankind has ever reached in 6,000 years. Even worse, as the days of Noah, but even worse than the days of Noah because of the, increase in knowledge, where sin is more readily available and violence is more devastating, back in the days of Noah, if you had a king or a ruler that was, a violent, wicked man, he could only harm so many people. But now we have kings, rulers, and leaders that have the finger on these triggers of these weapons that can devastate the entire earth. The entire earth, and without Yahweh stepping in, all the earth's inhabitants would be destroyed, as Yeshua said. Now on page 166, in verse 17, it says, well, in these last days, remember the last days, because that's what he's talking about here. In the last days, I'm going to gather my remnant. Gather my remnant. Well, he's already gathered your ancestors to this land. They're the ones that gave birth to you, and then Yahweh brought you to his house. So this great gathering has taken a few years to take place and mature. The land had to mature, and sometimes we don't really, if we're not really on guard, sometimes we'll forget, what all it took to get us to being here. We just kind of I kind of stumbled across the house of Yahweh, or, I got on a plane or a bus, or I drove to Abel there, but Yahweh actually for many, many years, he actually knew us far in advance, and he allowed things to fall just the way they did in our lives. Our lives were predetermined, to where we would be given this opportunity to be here at Yahweh's house at this point, in this time period, to be able to qualify for this great position and to actually be a part of this great remnant. But the land, in verse 18, the land had to mature. The Babylonish land not even established. Remember it said in Zechariah, the Babylonish land not established. It wasn't established until several years after Columbus supposedly discovered it so Britain could have power over it. The Queen sent him knowing full well where America was, I think. I think it was all a hoax to go down in history as another lie. Remember, he who wins the wars writes the history. But anyway, if you saw the news this morning, you actually saw who established, or who actually established this Babylonish land, and it was shown over and over in that clip. You remember that? It was the Catholic Church, and they kept repeating it. The Catholics, the Catholics, the Catholics. They were the ones establishing this Babylonish land, and have from the beginning here. We see it through their infrastructure. As Pastor showed in the Mark of the Beast books, the buildings and the monuments they have in Washington, D.C., many of them are exact replicas of what's in Rome, and what was in the Roman Empire. These statues and these columns and these huge columns and pillars, their obelisk and all these things, these are all duplicates of what we see in this Roman Empire. Even like Pastor showed the police badge, the policemen, their badge was a shield, and it was a little replica of a Roman shield. In verse 20, and in the last days, the two witnesses are shown carrying the truth, the complete, perfect truth of Yahweh. Remember, Psalm says, your laws are truth. The two witnesses were the ones who actually brought Yahweh's laws back to the people. And he says in Zechariah, one of those will be working with Yeshua the high priest, the spokesman of the two witnesses, this last witness. That's in Zechariah chapter 6. He'll be working with Yeshua the high priest. And he said, look at this branch now. Behold this branch, because he's going to branch out and he's going to establish the house of Yahweh in this Babylonish land that was spoken of in Zechariah chapter 5. Isn't that beautiful? Praise Yahweh. You know, it is to see how in these last days the two witnesses were shown carrying the complete, perfect truth of Yahweh, and how one of the witnesses will be working with Yeshua and will branch out to establish the house of Yahweh in this Babylonish land. You know, to see those things actually come to pass, which we weren't here, you know, when Pastor and Jacob came here and established the house of Yahweh and dedicated it. You know, there's a couple of people that were here, you know, but many of us, we weren't here to actually see those things, but we can go back and we can read and we can see the history and we've heard the testimony, you know, but to actually see the prophecies that are written, you know, and then actually see the fulfillment of those things, you know, is actually very amazing and marvelous in the sight to actually be able to witness and to read and to live in this time period, to actually see how everything fell in detail just as Yahweh foretold it, that it'd be two brothers from the same womb, how one would die, you know, and the spokesman of the two witnesses, you know, this one who would actually be able to preach this message to the entire world would actually be the one to usher in Yahweh's great kingdom. So please understand this, Pastor says on page 166 and verse 21. So please understand this. You've got to understand this prophecy that he's saying here. I'm going to gather you, my remnant. You're the remnant right here, sitting here in this house at this time. You know, and not all of us are gathered here, you know, but many of our brothers might be spread abroad in the different states or countries, you know, but this last day's work, whom Yahweh's building and bringing here to his house and calling out of this evil and adulterous generation, this is this remnant. He's sitting here right here in this house at this time. I'm going to gather my remnant from all those who I've driven from all of these countries throughout the world. I'm going to gather my remnant of them from this Babylonish land not yet established. You know, and this is why we're here, brothers, because Yahweh's actually gathered us. He's gathered us to be a part of this remnant. You know, it's up to each and every one of us and the choices we make on a daily basis of whether or not we're going to retain that crown, you know, retain that position as being Yahweh's remnant, you know, gathered in these last days, you know, and if we can continue to humble ourselves to the teachings that we're receiving from Yahweh through his house, through his servant Israel, if we can continue to humble ourselves to those teachings, that's going to be a crown that we'll be able to, you know, keep shining on our heads for all eternity, man. You know, as we go out and get sent out throughout the universe to bring Yahweh's laws and bring Yahweh's peace to all the inhabitants of the universe, we'll be actually able to carry that crown of being a part of Yahweh's last days remnant, brought out of this evil and adulterous generation, the worst that mankind had ever come to. And if we go over here in page 167, we're just going to read here Jeremiah 23, verse 10. It starts in verse 23, 24, 25, and 26. But Jeremiah 23, verse 10, it says, "For the land is full of adulterers, those who turn from following Yahweh to follow the gods, Elohim, because of this curse. The land mourns." Okay, and verse 9 says, "My heart is broken." And Pastor said that should be our hearts. Our hearts are broken because of this. Because you've rejected the laws. This is in verse 25. "Because you have rejected the laws, you filled the land full of adulterers, sodomites, you name it. Everything sinful." You know, and as society says it today, you know, whatever's consenting between two adults, you know, or whatever's consenting between, you know, underage children, you know, those things are all fine and appropriate. You know, they need to go experience the boys or experience the girls or experience the fun, you know, before they have to grow up. You know, by the time they grow up, they're half dead, you know, and falling fast. Jeremiah 23, verse 10, "The land mourns." This is in verse 26 on page 167, your 15th book of Yisrayl. "The land mourns, the pleasant places of the wilderness are dried up. Their conduct is evil." Remember that word evil. Remember that. Genesis 3, verse 5. "Follow the evil and you will be like the gods." Follow the evil. Do this evil. And that's exactly what the Vatican teaches 100%. They don't teach any righteousness. No righteousness is coming from the Vatican or from Christianity that I know of. It's all traditions, evil traditions. And Pope Francis has even caught some flack amongst even some of his own congregation, for actually saying things that aren't typical of a pope, such as, when questioned about sodomites, well, who am I to judge? Or, these different kind of bold statements, showing how they really, as pastors, they really don't care. They really don't care what you're doing in your own personal life, as long as you're supporting this divining serpent, bringing your money to the Catholic Church, bringing your money and bringing your children, making your sacrifices there to the Catholic Church, your sacrifices and your offerings, and besides what you do in your own personal life, well, who are they to judge? You can do whatever, just make sure you're Catholic and you're living as a Catholic by bringing your tithes and your offerings and your children to this Catholic Church, so they can be indoctrinated with this same garbage, that's been pushed forth since the time of the elders of Israel that turned from Samuel, which we know they were a branch off that came from Cain, that turned from Abel and his teachings, from this time. It's just been continual war, vengeance, and retaliation all the way down history to our point of life that we see right now. Now, no righteousness, remember, no righteousness is coming from the Vatican or from Christianity. It's all evil traditions. All evil traditions. And if you go on here to verse 32 and 33 on page 167, Pastor says, I want you to go over to 2 Timothy or 2 Timaiah, because we find a great prophecy here by the Apostle Shaul in 2 Timaiah. It's found on page 938 in your book of Yahweh. Now, this is actually speaking of the same thing that Jeremiah was speaking of in Jeremiah chapter 23. This gathering, the remnant of Yahweh's remnant gathering. We have a house full of the remnant here. I'm telling you, men, we're going to have to expand this sanctuary. Praise Yahweh. In 2 Timaiah 3 verse 1 now, you got it? 2 Timaiah 3 verse 1. Know this also, that in the last days, get that picture in your mind, because everything here in this chapter is talking about this time period that we're in right now, that the Savior called a generation. This generation will not pass until you see all these things fulfilled. So 2 Timaiah 3 verse 1, know this also, that in the last days perilous times will come. In 2 Timaiah 3 verse 2, for men will be lovers of themselves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, and unholy. And men, continue to remember that Yahweh called us out of this. He called us out of this, being lovers of ourselves, covetous, boasters, proud, arrogant. He called us here to His house so we could put on His perfect righteous character. Remember Yeketskia 36, shows Yahweh's attributes, and His attributes doesn't have any of that selfishness. It's selflessness. Laying down His time and His maybe His things that He would like to do to actually serve us. And this is the character of Yahweh, is to serve others. And remember, the character of the gods are to lift yourself up above another. So continue, men, making right choices. Continue to participate daily in practicing Yahweh's righteousness by showing, in every action, every situation, that you're going to be right by choosing righteousness. That's been taught to you here from Yahweh's great house. That's all the time I have. If you all please stand, may Yahweh bless your Sabbath. And at this time, if you all stand, I'll turn it over to the great Kohan, Michael Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom. Please be seated. All right. Got to take the gloves off. Whew. Left those on to the last minute. Well, we're in chapter 15. That's almost the amount of degrees it is out here. And Yahweh's talking to us in numbers. Okay, let's start off here on verse 41 here. Now remember, he is talking about 2 Timaiah 3 verse 1, talking about the last days. And jump down here on page 168 on verse 41. It says, now he's talking about, well, let's see, in verse 3 he talks about there's truce breakers, forgiving false accusers, without self-control. And then he goes on and talks about Isis. And in verse 41 he says, but there's another way of doing it, he says. There's another way, is Yahweh's way. Turning to him for protection. He says, because you're not going to protect yourselves. You're not going to protect yourself with war. You're going to have nothing more but trouble, right? And that's what we see in the world today, is everybody's fighting and everybody's at war with one another. But he says, you're going to be destroyed with war. And that's what Yahweh tells you. So Yahweh, he warns the people. He's always warned mankind what's going to take place if they go their own way instead of following his way. So he says, turn to the house of Yahweh. Turn to Yahweh. That's what he says. There's no power that can save you except Yahweh. Isaiah 45 is where that's at. So then he talks about the two witnesses that are going to establish the house of Yahweh. And then, of course, people, he says, who I've gathered from all nations that I've scattered them, he's going to bring forth this remnant. All right? Now, he goes on, he talks about how that 2 Timothy 3, verse 4 talks about traitors, betrayers, being headstrong, arrogant, lovers of pleasure. Of course, that's what you see today. It's everybody's lovers of pleasures. They find everything in the world that they can, rather than keep their minds studying and focused on where it should be. They do everything else. I jump down to verse 47 here on page 169. Lovers of pleasures more than lovers of Yahweh. He says, if you're in that position, then you're not going to make it in the kingdom. Verse 5 says, having a form of holiness, but denying the authority. Notice, the authority, because if you don't submit to Yahweh's authority, you won't be part of his children. That is part of his family. And the reason that the house of Yahweh was established here is for the reason that Yahweh wants you in his family. He wants you to become a part of his family. That's why he established it. And that's what the word house actually means, is one of the meanings is family. And so he wants us to be in his family. But you won't be in his family if you're a rebellious son. And like it says here, there were betrayers, there was some were headstrong, arrogant, lovers of pleasure. These are rebelliousness, okay, being headstrong. And they denied the authority of it, notice in verse 5. Denying Yahweh's authority, and from such, notice he warns you, from such turn away. Turn away from these people. Turn away from sodomites. Turn away from fornicators. Turn away from adulterers. Turn away from people who practice bestiality. Turn away from the Pope and the Vatican and all that system. From such things, turn away. You've got to come out of her, my people, Yahweh says. Or else we're still part of that world. And if we do remain as part of the world, then we are servants to whom we obey. And we will remain separate from Yahweh. And we'll never have an opportunity to be a part of that family if that's the route that we choose. In verse 6, he continues on. He says, for they are the sort who creep into the houses of Yahweh and lead away silly women. Okay, and that silly women, that's a contemptuous term of weak-minded. Okay. In verse 7, they're always learning, notice, but they're never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Yet they learn, okay? They learn certain things, but they can never, ever grasp them to really understand what the truth is and totally accept the truth. He says, now get this one. Here in verse 8, now as Iones and Iambres opposed Moshe, he says, you remember who they are? Anyone remember? He says, I'll tell you who they were. They were the magicians, the Coptic Catholic magicians that were sent out to try and make out like they had power, like they had this magical power. They swing the wand and do all these sorts of things. Well, Yahweh proved them liars and showed them where the real power came from. And he was more powerful than all the gods and the magicians of Egypt. That is, the God worshippers, the Catholics. It says, did you know that Catholic, that's where the word came from. Catholic back there in Egypt. And they brought it out of Egypt with the 12 tribes. Now, if you remember, in Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, one of the laws is, he's talking about the kings, and he says, you must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself and make the people return to Egypt to get more. Okay, because you see, they put their trust in power of the armies and of horses. And the scriptures describe the horses going into battle, and how their nostrils will flare out, and they'll begin to rear themselves up and wanting to pull up the reins, and just so very eager to go into war, because that's what they're trained to do. And they're very, very eager to run off and get involved in the battle, and the soldiers have to hold them back until it's time, and when it's time, then they let them loose and they take off to go into it. But this is a means by which, when you see about the horses, it's talking about the great armies and the power of the force that they use. So the law required that that the king must not acquire great numbers of horses, and cause the people to turn back to Egypt to get more, because this is where they had gotten them from and brought them out of Egypt, if you remember. And then also the horse, of course, was also had to do with the sun god, because you had the chariot and being pulled by the horses, and this was what the sun god rode upon. Again, pulling you back to Egypt again, because that's where sun worship comes from. Okay, that's what the Catholic Church does. But anyway, Yahweh said, you must not go back that way again. Okay, he told him, he says, don't go back into Egypt. Okay, now if you remember, let me read it to you here. Okay, this is Yirmiyah 42, verses 11 through 15, and then 19 and 20. And he says, do not be afraid of the king of Babylon. Now this is the prophet Yirmiyah talking to the remnant of Yada. And he says, don't be afraid of the king of Babylon, of whom you are afraid. Do not be afraid of him, says Yahweh, for I am with you to save you and deliver you from his hands. And since I show you mercy, then he will show you mercy. Okay, the king of Babylon he's talking about. He says, so Yahweh's telling him, he says, since I show you mercy, well, you don't have to worry about it. Don't be afraid. The king of Babylon is going to show you mercy as well and allow you to return to your own land. But if you say, we will not live in this land, disobeying the voice of Yahweh your father, by saying, no, we will go to Egypt, where we will see no more war, nor hear the sound of the trumpet, nor starve for lack of food, and we will live there. Well, Yirmiyah says, then hear the word of Yahweh, O remnant of Yada. This is what Yahweh of hosts, the Father of Israel, says. If you have completely made up your mind to go to Egypt, and if you go and settle there, then in verse 19, Yahweh has told you, O remnant of Yada, do not go to Egypt. Know certainly that I have warned you of this day, that you are making a fatal mistake, for you yourself sent me. Now this is Yirmiyah speaking. He says, you are making a fatal mistake, for you yourself sent me to Yahweh your father, saying, pray to Yahweh our Father for us, and let us know all that Yahweh your Father says. Declare it to us, and we will do it. Now that's what they had told the prophet Yirmiyah. Said, look, we know that Yahweh is with you. Go to Yahweh and find out. And whatever Yahweh says, whether it's great or bad, on us, then we'll listen to what you have to say. Well, the very same people, the leaders who sent him to go and inquire of Yahweh, when he came back and told them that, they stood up and they said, this is Yirmiyah 43 verses 1 and 2, when Yirmiyah finished speaking all the words of Yahweh their father to all the people, everything Yahweh had sent to tell him, Azariah son of Hoshea, Yachanan son of Kareah, and other arrogant and self-willed men spoke, saying to Yirmiyah, you're lying. Yahweh our Father has not sent you to say to us, do not go to Egypt and settle there. So even though they told him and begged him to go inquire of Yahweh, when he came back with the answer, they turned right back on him and said, no, you're lying. Well, if you remember in Acts 7 verses 37 to 39, he talked about Moshe, and it says, this is what Moshe, who said to the children of Israel, Yahweh your Father will raise up to you a prophet like me from your brothers, him you will hear. This is he who was among the called out ones in the wilderness with the Moloch, who spoke to him in Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the doctrine of life to give to us, whom our fathers would not obey, but they rejected him. So in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. Okay, they turned back to the Coptic Catholic religion. Now, this I thought was an interesting note by Albert Barnes. He says, In their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. He says, in their hearts. He says, they wished to return to Egypt. They regretted that they had come out of Egypt and desired again the things which they had there, as preferable to what they had in the desert. Maybe, however, the expression means not that they desired literally to return to Egypt, but that their hearts inclined to the habits and the morals of the Egyptians. They forsook Yahweh and imitated the idolatries, which of course is God worship, of the Egyptians. Okay, so they took on the morals, and that's exactly what we see that they did, They did exactly that. So, getting back here on page 169, Pastor continues and he says, now as Yahweh said in 1 Samuel 8, this is what you've done ever since I brought you out. Ever since I brought them out, they continued to go back to searching and seeking after the gods of Egypt. He says they want to worship the gods, and that's what they're doing in Egypt. Yahweh isn't a god. There's one thing that Yahweh showed to begin with, and that is that he isn't a god. History said that, plainly said, well, what is the name of your God? But he wasn't in the books of the Catholic Church. You remember whenever Moshe went before Pharaoh and asked, and Pharaoh said, well, who is this Yahweh? But it wasn't in the books. They couldn't find the name of Yahweh in the name of the gods, because Yahweh's not a god, so naturally his name would not be listed there. But these gods are universal, and that's why they're called universal, which means they worship all the gods and they don't turn any gods down. The gods are the ones that they worship, and the gods are the ones that they give all honor and glory to. And that's what the whole sun-worshiping system is based upon. In verse 7, and if you remember now, sun worship, okay? The sun god's name, the big god, was Ra, okay, which was an Egyptian god. In verse 7, this is continuing on in 2 Timothy 3. In verse 7, he says, they're always learning, yet never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. He says, now they're just like these two magicians that opposed Moshe. Now remember the first words, okay? The first words of this verse was, in 2 Timothy 3 verse 1, know this, that in the last days perilous times would come. Okay, so he's talking about the last days, all right? And that's what he's referring to here. And this is what the Apostle Shalom was talking about, that in the last days these things would take place. Now, he's speaking of the last days, and they're going to do the same thing. They're doing the same thing right now. The Pope is trying to use these little short scripts, like saying, well, do you want salvation for Jesus, or do you want to follow a bunch of laws? And he says, see, that's supposed to mean something. And what does it mean? Well, it means that man is too wicked, too evil to follow the laws of Yahweh. Instead, they want to go their own way, right? They want to make up their own way of salvation. Just like they've made up this God to try and give them salvation, okay? Matthew 7, Yeshua said that no wicked tree will be able to bring forth righteousness. Well, the Pope can't bring forth righteousness. And then Pastor says, I can't bring forth evil. That's what Yahweh says. And remember, he says that in Matthew 7 here, verses 17 through 20. He says, likewise, every righteous tree brings forth, notice, remember that word brings forth. Remember Pastor talked about that in his sermons, about bringing forth. But he says, every righteous tree brings forth righteous fruit. But a tree of evil brings forth fruit of iniquity. A righteous tree, notice, cannot bring forth the fruit of iniquity, nor can a tree of evil bring forth fruits of righteousness. Okay? You just can't do it. The two can't be done. Okay? Every tree which does not bring, now notice something here. I want you, very important. A righteous tree cannot bring forth fruit of iniquity, nor can a tree of evil bring forth fruits of righteousness. So just like Pastor says here, I can't bring forth evil, just like the Pope can't bring forth righteousness. If you ever hear of anyone speaking and saying that Israel Hawkins tries to do anything, I mean anything, that is not in accordance with the law of Yahweh, that person is a damnable liar, and you better rebuke him for it. Because he cannot bring forth evil. You understand that? That's straight from the word of Yahweh. All right? Straight from the word of Yahweh. Yisrael Hawkins cannot bring forth evil. He brings forth righteousness. Okay? Very important, because sometimes people will subtly say something that, because you see, they don't understand something. They only see bits and pieces of certain things, and then they make a conclusion of something and say something when they really don't know the whole story. And so it makes it look like as if pastor has done something, and because they don't understand what he's doing, because they're not him, he's the wisest man on the face of this earth, far wiser than every man in the house of Yahweh put together. And so if you don't understand what he has done, because you don't know, because you know what? He lives by the Scripture, every word of the Scripture, because it says don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. So don't expect that if you're working on something that you're going to know everything that's going on, because you do not, and you never will. Okay? Because he guards everything very carefully. So if you don't, if things are not understood, don't ever think that pastor's doing something wrong. Okay? You just don't know the full story behind it. Okay? So remember, a righteous tree cannot bring forth evil fruit. And that's Yeshua's own words. And so every tree that does not bring forth righteous fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. So be careful, because you may end up being cast into the fire if you think that way. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Okay? Now, of course, this is shown in the plan of Yahweh from the very beginning, if everybody understands the analogy of it. If you remember in Genesis 1:12, Yahweh said, and the fruit produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kind, and seed-bearing trees according to their kind. Okay? And Yahweh, of course, saw that it was right. Right? So, that's just something that we can count on. Okay. Back in the book here in verse 56, he says, now notice carefully what he said. In verse 8, so also do these men oppose the truth. Now remember, it's talking about the last days, because 2 Timothy 3 verse 1 says this refers to the last days. In the last days, these same men who opposed Moshe, of course, were Catholics. So these same men were going to oppose the house of Yahweh in the last days. Okay? In the last days. Now, these two magicians, Egyptian magicians, are named here. And in one of the commentaries, this is Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, Eusebius, in the preparation of the gospel, quotes from Numerianus that Aenes and Abros were sacred scribes, which were a lower order of priests in Egypt, skilled in magic. Hiller interprets Aenes from the Abyssinian language to mean a trickster, and Iambres to mean a juggler. Okay, and so that's exactly what they've done. They throw the scriptures up and down, they toss it back and forth, and they end up tricking the people with their lies that they teach in the Catholic Church. So remember now, what this is saying, that in the last days, the same as Moshe, okay, who's a lawgiver, right? And just like Yahweh says, he's going to send someone in the last days just like Moshe, okay, who will bring forth the laws of Yahweh. You see the same exact pattern here. Just like Moshe was opposed, you also see in the fact that the Catholic Church is opposing the same thing as the Apostle Shaul said here in these last days against Yisrael Hawkins. Now he says that's why they're opposing us, because we are going to oppose Babylon in these last days. But of course they're going to fail. We're chipping away at that block that's joining and more joining us every day, and it's going to get more and more so, because the snowball is growing, as he says. So also now, continuing to say 2 Timothy 3, so also do these men oppose the truth, the men of corrupt minds. Okay, their minds are corrupt, their minds are corrupt, and otherwise they wouldn't be pushing the sodomy and all that goes along with it, because sodomy is evil. It disrupts and it corrupts the mind, and that's what he's saying here. It corrupts the mind, okay, because any sin affects the mind, but sodomy is the worst thing that there is, because it corrupts the mind by putting in the brain the microorganisms into your brain, these little mites, these little sodomites, okay? That's why the sodomites have these little mites that go in there when they create this sodomy, and it goes into the brain, and and these microorganisms go in and poison a person's mind. Now, if you remember here, and he says that, you have to fight this the rest of your life to get any truth put in there. You remember Romans chapter 1, verse 26 says, for this reason Yahweh gave them over to degrading passions, right? Degrading passions. And then in the King James, in Romans 7, verse 5, it says, for when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. Fruit. Remember, a righteous tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, nor can an evil tree bring forth righteous fruit, or it brings forth fruit unto death. Okay? And this motions of sin, okay, that's those degrading passions. Those two words come from one another. In Romans 1:26 and in Romans 7:5. And this is what he's talking about here, that these degrading passions, this sodomy that has been taught to the people and put into people's minds, this is what's in their heads now. And it's completely messed them up big time. Like he says in verse 58, now the attention span is less than a goldfish. Okay? A goldfish, you can keep the attention of a goldfish quicker than you can a person's mind. Isn't that something, man? That's how pathetic it is that man's mind has gotten this way. Because they've totally corrupted it. Now he says, then he goes on, of course, it says the gates of hell is not going to prevail against this last day's work. It can't, because it can't wipe out the work. It can't wipe us out. We can't die. If we die, then there'll be nobody to resurrect. How in the world can anyone be resurrected? Remember Hebrews 11? They're all waiting on us to become perfected so that we can bring them alive, make them alive again and resurrect them. But without us, there's no hope for anybody. So he says, read for yourself there in verse 9. He says, underline that verse and study it over and over and over. He says, it's true. Not one of these things is going to fail. Okay? Not one prophecy. Not one is going to fail. We can believe the prophecies. Because you see, if the prophecy fails, that means Yahweh's a liar. That means the entire book of Yahweh and every promise that Yahweh's ever given is a complete lie. And that Yeshua never existed and so forth. But Yeshua said you're a fool if you don't believe in the prophets, right? So the believing in the prophecies, that's the only thing that can keep you from being deceived, because the prophecies is what reveals Yahweh unto his people and shows us that Yahweh is who he is, that he is our Heavenly Father, and that he knows all, because prophecy is proof that Yahweh is who he is. Verse 62, in verse 9 he says, but they will proceed no further. Notice, they're not going to go any further. They're going to try, they're going to oppose the truth, come against the house of Yahweh, but they will proceed no further. Now remember, the truth is brought out here. See, and they're going to oppose the truth, and that means they're fighting against the last day's work, which is guided by Yeshua the high priest. Okay? But they're going to be cut off, because they'll never be able to destroy the work of Yahweh. Yahweh has allowed that for years and years and years, thousands of years for mankind to go about, and it's proof that he has never, ever allowed his work to come to nothing. Because remember what the prophet Isaiah said, his word goes out, but it never returns back into him void without accomplishing the thing in which he set it out to do. Okay? So when he sets out to do something, he always brings it to completion. And Yahweh's very patient. Yahweh will wait and has waited for 6,000 years just to bring his plan to completion here. And he's doing it with us. And that's a great blessing that we're alive in these last days to see these things. Praise Yahweh. Now jump down to verse 67 there. He says, but remember, he's talking about that great gathering, which kind of Matthew talked about earlier. But from your ancestors, notice, he says, wherever you were in the world, whatever nation they were, in order for you to be here today, he says, are you listening to me? In order for you to be in this building today, tonight, Yahweh started your calling before you were ever born. He started gathering your ancestors here to this land. Yes, and from there, every nation where he scattered our ancestors, He's bringing forth a remnant now. He's bringing forth a remnant that you're sitting here in this building. Now, that reminds me of the scriptures in Ephesians chapter 1 and Ephesians 3. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3 through 5 and then 9 through 12, it says, "Blessed be Father Yahweh," okay? "Blessed be Yahweh, the Father of our King, Yeshua Messiah, who has blessed us with all spiritual blessings of the heavens in Messiah." All spiritual blessings Yahweh has blessed us with, okay? Verse 4, "Because he chose us with him before the foundation of the world." Before the foundation of the world, Yahweh had chosen us already. If you remember, just past, last sermon before that, Pastor spoke about that, how that Yahweh knew us, way back then. But we hadn't come into existence yet, but we were known by him, okay? He knew us. He chose us before the foundation of the world that we were to be holy and without blame before him in love. You see that? That's what Yahweh has in store for us, to be holy and to be without blame. That's why we're striving now to try and get this stuff out of our lives, anything that tears us away from him, that separates us. You notice verse 5, "Preordaining us to be his children." Okay? He preordained us to be his children by adoption through Yeshua Messiah. Now, that doesn't mean that we pre-existed, okay, in the sense of like we were gods beforehand. No, but Yahweh preordained us, okay? He had already had it in his mind, knowing that he would call us forth at a certain time that we would be born, according to his plan, and that we would be adopted through Yeshua Messiah, because Yeshua Messiah was the firstborn. Remember Romans 8? Yeshua is the firstborn among many brethren, okay? The very firstborn, which means he was first, and others will follow. "Having revealed to us," this is verse 9, Ephesians 1 verse 9, "having revealed to us the great secret of his plan." Well, now you remember, the great secret of his plan has been revealed to us, because remember, Revelation 10:7 says that is going to finally be finished by the seventh Moloch, right? So he's revealed to us this great secret of his plan according to his righteous pleasure, which he has purposed to himself. So he takes great pleasure in us. And here's the reason why, it's all for the administration of his house at the completed time. Now that's the time that Daniel saw, okay, the prophet Daniel saw, that in the last days, this would come to pass at the completed time. To do what? To gather together in one to himself under one head the Messiah, both the things that are yet in the heavens and the things also for the earth. Okay, the things for the earth in him, in whom also we were allotted an inheritance. We were allotted an inheritance, okay? Being preordained, as he set forth, as all things work according to the plan of his plan, in order that we, having first trusted in the Messiah, would become a praise of his glory. So we have to first trust in Yeshua, okay, and prove ourselves worthy, and then we will become, the praise of his glory. So all the suffering and everything that we have to go through right now is all going to pass. And it's all going to be very well worth it. That we're finally going to see it all come to an end. Because remember, like it says, we'll be like calves leaping from the stall. And Yahweh tells us in Revelation, he's going to wipe out all pain, all tears, all sorrow, everything from us, So it's going to be well worth it. Ephesians 3, wrapping up here. Ephesians 3, verses 9 through 11, he says, "And to make all called out ones see how this secret is administered." Okay, now remember, we just read that we were allotted an inheritance. Okay, and this great secret is shown to us, so it's for the administration of his house. So it's to make us to see how this secret is administered, which has been hidden in Yahweh from the beginning of the ages, notice, who created all things. It's been hidden. No one else could understand it. Only we, the seventh era of the house of Yahweh, can understand these prophecies. No one's ever been able to understand them before. No one. We're the only ones who have ever understood these things. And notice, for this purpose, why did he create all things? For this purpose, that it might now be made known to the principalities and the powers in the heavens. In the heavens. He's letting them know, all the powers and the principalities in the heavens, that through the called out ones, the manifold wisdom of Yahweh, and all according to the plan of ages which he carried into effect through Yeshua Messiah. So all of his plan was brought forth through Yeshua Messiah to show us that that is what we can look upon. Man, and even the Apostle Shalom, you remember later on, went on and said, look, if Yeshua was not resurrected and there's no resurrection, then what hope is there for mankind? You know, there's nothing, you know. So he showed us and proved over and over and over again the fact that Yeshua was the Messiah, and the fact that Yeshua's promises, all the promises was given to him. He was the firstborn among many brethren, and so that is where we can put our hope in and see that these things are going to be given unto us. And so Pastor Enzi says, may Yahweh bless you, and I turn the service back over to the next speaker. I love you. May Yahweh bless you, man. If you go